this is so weird. Has anyone hooked this up to their face before? I feel like I'm at the dentist office or something. I hope I don't seem that scared. So before I get started in my talk about error handling in Node and all across the stack, I just want to ask you a couple of questions. First question, why is there a table here? But second question, like how many of you guys use Node in production? So 25%? Okay, so out of those, how many of you guys are using Express? Basically all of them. Anyone using Happy or one happy guy? Any other frameworks out there that you guys are using from Node? Just curious. Koa, there you go. What? Kraken. Yeah, Kraken, there you go. That's PayPal stuff. Restify? Yeah, so there's a couple different frameworks, but for the vast majority of people are using Express. I'm mostly going to talk about error handling with Express. What about on the client side? Raise your hand if you're an Angular user. Ember users. Angular actually won. Where's the React guy? Awesome. Flight. Hey. And Backbone. Any Backbone people still around? Oh, man. It's like 3. There's 3. That's amazing. All right. I just wanted to get to know you a little bit better because you'll learn a little bit about me. So I used to work at Odesk, and we wanted to convince everyone at Odesk that it was a super awesome idea to use Node.js. Like, oh, Node is so cool. PHP is the dumps. We're going to move everything to Node. So they're like, OK, you can test it out on this really cool mobile web app we're going to work on. You know, people can log in, and they can manage their contractors that they're working with. And we built this thing. It was really shiny. It was a nice app. And so it's like running for a few days. And I get this message, this email from our IT guy. And he's like, hey, so your Node server went crazy again and just started eating up all of the disk on the server. I stopped the app and restarted it and deleted all the logs, and it's fine. And like, my whole story about Node being so easy to use and so reliable is just like totally sank to the ground. But I'm like, no, it's fine. Like, I'll just like update my Node modules, and like probably it's like CentOS or something's fault. So a couple days later, I get the same email again, like, hey, your Node server like started just like destroying the server. It actually took down the production website. So I'm going to have to move Node to its own little sandbox environment and limit the amount of disk space it gets. And this is not looking good for your whole Node. Is awesome. So he said, but this time I preserved the logs. And I thought, perfect. I'm going to take those logs. I'll get this thing solved in 5 minutes. So here are the logs. Anyone know what's wrong? OK, first of all, you can't read it. But second of all, if you could read it, you would get absolutely no information. There's nothing in this stack trace that has anything to do with my app. And so I'm sitting there thinking like, okay, having a little bit of a panic, right? Because like I'm trying to convince the company to move to Node. I can't figure out what's wrong. But I'm like, I know what this is. This is open source, you know? It's someone else's problem. So I get on IRC, and you know, I felt a little bit bad because, you know, I know these guys that work on Express they're amazing engineers. They do some great things. They're doing this in their spare time. But I had to tell them, you know, I regret to inform you, but there's a serious bug in your app. There's something wrong with your module. And like, so I go in IRC. I'm in chat, and like, person 1, you're a moron. Person 2, like, that's so funny. It infinite loops and fills up your logs. That's so great. Haha. And I'm like, you don't understand. Like, this is huge. Like, no, it isn't working for me. And it was sort of terrifying. And so it's always your problem, right? With open source, you work on a module, it's your problem. You want some better documentation for AngularJS? Who's complained about docs for AngularJS? A lot of people out. Anyone that's used AngularJS has complained about the docs. Guess what? It's your problem. Go fix them. It's open source. So that's one thing I learned about open source. It's always your problem. So what can you do about it? Well, for me and my challenges with Express, I dug deeper into the code. I finally sort of figured out how to work around this problem. And for me, I had to learn how to do proper error handling in my app. Obviously, the problems you're going to face in your app are a little bit different, so I want to share what I learned from this experience. So after I'm there at Odesk, we worked on this. I got an amazing opportunity to go work with PayPal on the Kraken project. Basically, we built this wrapper on top of Express to add security, add a whole bunch of cool functionality, internationalization, and all this as we're trying to take all of our Java things and move them to Node. They'd already been convinced of the stability story before I got there, thankfully, because I wouldn't have had very good evidence for them with my previous experience. And so I started working on the team there. And the thing is, what happens when you take a team of Java engineers and you get them writing Node.js code? Just, they write a bunch of TryCatches all over the place, right? Because like in Java, if you have problems, you can try and catch them. What happens when you throw an async JavaScript? Anyone know? You can't catch them, right? It's just like, but they will crash your server. So you've got this rolling monster running around, crashing things, and you can't catch it. You can't grab a hold of it. There's nothing that you can do about those errors running around in your application. So what do you do? For me, it was this point of like, I moved over to the team. I was really excited to work on a project with a bunch of great team members, but we found all this legacy code, this brand new Node code that people had written, not using any best practices. So what it came down to is figuring out what those best practices were for error handling in Node. I don't know if you see this picture, but this thing's called a snoot sucker, and what you do is you put it in the nose of the child, and you literally suck out the snot. It's amazing. That's my daughter. I did get her permission, my wife's permission before using this picture. But you've got to learn the best practices, right? This is the best tool I've ever used for getting clearing snot out of my child's nose. And in Node, there's not a lot of clarity around the best practices for handling errors, right? Some people are like, oh, domains, and other people are like, oh, I just use promises. But like, it's not really like comprehensive plan to solve errors. Like, we deal with people's money. I don't know, how many of you have PayPal accounts? All right, and this is going to be bad, but how many of you have been mad at PayPal at some point in your life? Right, half the audience, awesome. So, good job, guys. So we're trying to fix that. Like, we're building cool things, and it will be really awesome, and I'd love for you to come and join us in San Jose, but that's a later discussion. So what I decided to do, new on the team as a lead there, building some consumer apps with Node, is come up with a couple of best practices of how we should be doing things, how we can handle errors from the back end, from our services layer all the way down to putting them in front of our users. So kind of full stack error handling. And so I'm going to get to some of the things some of the practices we're using at PayPal. They're not perfect. Like, this is trial and error. I'd love to hear some of the stuff you guys are doing at your places. But I'll share with you a few of the things that we're doing, and then we'll have time for questions. You can pick at me and come up with better ways to do some of this stuff. So first thing, like TryCatch. The only case where I know that it's a good idea to use TryCatch is when you're doing JSON.parse. When you're doing JSON.parse, if you have invalid data that you're sending into it, it can crash. It can throw. And so it's really, really good to try and catch that and do something with the error, right? Like, obviously, I don't know how you need to handle your error because it's different for every case. But that's a really important thing that you need to do. But other than that, I haven't seen very many cases where I would recommend using the TryCatch pattern in your Node apps. So that's the first thing. Anytime I see people throwing in the Node code in our application, I get really, really nervous. And I'm presuming almost in every case that they're just basically doing it wrong. So avoid TryCatch except for this JSON.parse case. That's one. The second thing is the callback pattern. More than anything else, I would recommend that every single person working on Node just get really, really familiar with the callback pattern. It's the most boring thing in the whole world, right? You pass in a callback, have some sort of I'll just point. You pass in a callback there and your callback takes an error and some sort of data or whatever's coming back or, whatever it may be. And then the first thing that you should do is do something with that error object. Now, a couple things that I want to point out here with the callback pattern. One, that error should always be an error object. If you're calling back with a string or you're calling back with a number, this is almost always likely going to lead to more problems. whenever you're calling back from an asynchronous function, call back with a proper error object. Just if you don't have one coming down from your services, just go new error and then whatever message is. Anyone know why it's useful to have error objects? Ryan, you have any idea?
Yes, so that you actually have a stack to trace through instead of just getting a stupid string that doesn't tell you anything.
Yeah, exactly. Because strings are not super helpful as errors. They're helpful as messages for users. So it's important that we have a stack trace. And if you create an error object, you'll always have that stack trace. So I'm a huge fan of using error objects for all the things. I'm trying to think if there's any other big things to point out. One other pattern that I'll just mention here is when you handle that error, I always handle it first and recommend returning immediately. So usually in that if block right there, I'll do if error, do something with that error, and then return. Because what I found is that it's extremely important to not accidentally then continue like nothing happened. And sometimes developers get a little bit confused and they think, well, if error, I do something with the error, and then they just sort of let the flow continue. So don't do that. Any questions about the callback pattern? I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about it before I move on, because I feel like it's so important. It's like so boring. People are like, what kind of question would I have? I feel like someone's scratching their head. Is it a question? No. Okay. Moving on. So one of the things that we've done at PayPal that I really, really like is this pattern of creating custom error objects. So has anyone subclassed errors in their Node experiments before? Okay, 3 or 4 people. Let me give you a little bit of a pitch for creating your own custom error objects. And the syntax that you find here is the best syntax I could come up with that does all the essential things that errors need to do. You have a stack trace. It preserves a message of that you pass into the error, and it's an instance of error. So if someone was doing some sort of type checking and making sure that you had a real error object, this type of object would pass. So I could go and create my new mountain error with my message. It's too freaking cold in Utah. And it would work just like any other error. But the clever thing about doing custom errors, and we do this all the time at PayPal, is you can start making errors like a server error object. So we created a server error object, and we'll pass in a message for the message of the error, but then we'll also pass in a whole bunch of information about what services we were hitting, what port, what time, all this sort of stuff we can pass in as additional items that we append to that error. And while none of that information ends up back in front of the user, it's really helpful in our debugging. So why did this problem occur? Well, let's check our server logs, and we have a super fat stack trace of where it occurred. And then we also will have a whole bunch of information about the services that were called and all sort of extra information around that error. So I highly recommend looking into doing custom errors. There's some blog posts about it there, but frankly, this is the best, the simplest code that will create custom errors that have worked for me. And the last thing I want to talk about are just a few conventions. What I found a lot in programming on large teams, and especially distributed teams, is that it's really important to have some conventions, some best practices in place. Because, frankly, there's about 20 different ways to do something, but just making sure that your team uses a single way is really, really important. So I'll read these, and then I can go into a little more specifics of code in a second. First thing, always deal with error objects. If you ever see in your code a string or a number being passed as the first argument in a callback, you should just change it. Just wrap it in new error immediately, right then. It will almost always still work. You should probably make sure your test still passes and all that first. But it's always a good idea to use error objects because of those stack traces. The next thing is, with regard to doing something with errors, if you're in a normal callback situation, or if you're in an Express middleware situation, for those of you using Express, you almost always want to just, if you get an error, send it as the first argument of the callback or the first argument of your next function, and then just return after that. That will allow Express's sort of default middleware handler or whatever callback handling you have to handle the error in the sanest way possible. Oftentimes we ignore errors in middleware I've seen, and that can lead to really weird problems down the road where you think the session should have certain values built into it, you rely on those values to exist, and they don't. The solution to that is just nexting with an error, which will then cancel that whole request flow. Another important thing about error handling that it took me a while to understand why this was important is when you do process.on uncut exception, when you try to handle those errors that do get thrown randomly, you must always process.exit at the end of that. And people might ask, Why do I do that? Does anyone not do this or know about the problem here? Okay, it was a poorly written question, poorly asked question. So the issue is, if you listen for an uncaught exception error, and then you don't kill the process, what you'll have is you'll have these connections, like whoever was made that request that killed the server will just be hanging there open until the whole thing times out. And if you were doing something like, say, logging out or some sort of security check process that sort of never completed, you can have really weird things like open database connections that are just sort of leaking off into the ethereal space. So it's very important just to exit that process, let that connection discontinue, and then have a new server process start up immediately to handle it. A couple other things that we're doing, and I can show code examples in a second, is we have a helper function anytime at the controller level where you have any errors you want to send down to the server that has the standard contract that it works with on the server, so or with the client. So anytime that we have an error, we pass it to this error handler function, and we also pass in the request and response objects, and then we'll send that down to the client in a really standard way where you always know the format of that error. That way, on the client side, we're using Backbone, and we've overridden backbone.sync to look for that error object, and it will know how to handle it and trigger the appropriate errors on the models. It's very consistent in every single one of our client-server communications. Errors are always going to be handled in the same way, and I highly recommend doing it like that. Another important fact is you have to log every error. We also log our client-side errors. Log them not just in files, but like in a place where you actually see them, aggregate them, that sort of thing. And finally, don't throw if you have any other way to handle an error. Like, I find throwing to usually mean I give up and I want the server to crash. I just don't know what else to do. But for the most part, you don't really want to throw if there's another way to handle the problem. So those are the conventions. Before I go into code, does anyone have any questions about a specific area of error handling in the Node stack that I can try and show some examples for? What's your name? Blue sweater? Yeah. Murphy. Hi, Murphy. I'm Jamund. Yeah, we have like the worst prescribed pattern, like the ghettoest pattern, which is we have window.error, and on window.onError, we basically post something to the server. And the only thing I'll mention briefly about that is you need to make sure that your errors don't cascade. So we make sure that per page load, you can only send like 2 or 3 errors, right? We have this sort of limiter on there. That, if you're in Chrome, that'll give you a stack trace, and it's reasonably helpful. So we log those at the server level, and then we have some aggregation that will go in, and we can notice when there are trends with our client-side errors. There are some great tools out there to do client-side error handling that we're not using right now, but I'd recommend you use them. Any other questions about specifics, and then I'll go into some details on code. We send it back to the same server. There's obviously there can be some problems with that, but for the types of errors that we're generally dealing with, which is programmer mistakes, or weird session stuff where the user, we didn't get all the information we expected when we created those objects on the client side, it works pretty well. Great, let me go into a couple specific examples in the next few minutes that I have about how this actually looks in code. And let's see. I'll go back to that in a second. So this is what our basic error handler looks like. Can you guys all see that okay? I can't do anything about it, actually, so never mind. Who cares? So basically, we have this function, and every single route that we have, we just require this function, and it will it's its own module. We call it responses, and then we'll just call responses.handleError, and we'll pass in an error and request and response. And that'll do a little bit of checking to make sure that, hey, if we don't have a real error object, let's just call this message. It'll just send down an internal server error message, and then we use res.json to make sure that we have a consistent JSON object going back down to the client. An important thing that anytime you have an error, we log it. So in here, I'm just showing console.logging the error and the message in the stack. In real life, we actually send that to an aggregation service internally. But we can do fancier things with error handlers. Here's the client-side code on the error handler. So if you have an error in your route, we pass that directly to the error handler. Otherwise, we just continue. So let me show you what we can do that's interesting with error handlers. How many of you guys deal with internationalization in your code? 20-ish%. So this is the thing that was the hardest problem for us to solve. We created these custom error objects to handle translation. Because what we found is that it was really difficult for us to get, like when an error happened on the server, it was difficult for us to get the correct message to the user in their language. It was really easy for us to create an English language error, but in order to create a translated error message, we had to do some fancy stuff. So I created this special error class. In this case, I'm calling it Babel error. It's called something else at PayPal. And it just has a get message function added to the prototype. With that method, we use something called Makara. It's an open source library as part of the Kraken project to do our translation. And then in our, crap, where's my other slide? No. Okay. In our error handler, instead of, I thought I had another slide about the error handler for this. So instead of doing just taking the message as is, we wrap the thing in the get message call, and it will translate that message. If they didn't send in something that has, if they didn't send in a type of Babel error, then we will send just the error message in English. So it works really well. We get translated error messages down just by using custom error objects, and it's pretty sweet. So I like that. Someone else asked a question to me outside about domains, and what I have to say about domains is TJ Fontaine, dang it, why are you saying something different than I am? TJ Fontaine at Node Day said, if you really love domains, stop. TJ Fontaine's the Node project lead. I get the idea that it's not something that people are really excited about on Node Core anymore. I don't know how far, where it's really going. I hope I didn't take the quote out of context, but that's what I understand, that it's not something that's being pushed very much anymore. And using the techniques that I mentioned today, it's not necessary to really, it's not necessarily to really use domains, because so much of what you can do if you just use the callback pattern and handle errors pretty consistently, you don't necessarily need that functionality. That's my 2 cents. Anyway, I'm Jamund. Awesome. Well, I think I'm done. Thank you so much for having me speak.